Thank you. It's great to be with you, and please don't tell John Dunford that last bit. I've just been at, it really is, what a fantastic audience. And I've been going around the country, actually, and it's very difficult to get people out of school at the moment. So the fact that you're here, I think, is a real success story for Opening Minds. And looking forward to seeing how this develops. I've just been this morning speaking at a conference on funding of schools, and you probably don't want to know where that went to. Clearly, we have been saying that it's important to keep funding levels up. But at that conference was Vernon Coker, the schools minister, and he said, "Where are you going on to next?" And I said, "I'm going to Opening Minds." He said, and Vernon and I both come from Nottinghamshire. "Opening Minds," he said. So which is very appropriate for him. So no, here we are. And great to listen to you, Jim. And good actually for the NHT to contribute to the review of the primary curriculum. And I've discovered two things actually that we both have in common. One is a rear view mirror with a very long perspective. And I was just thinking at the beginning of this term that it was 40 years ago that I first set foot in a primary classroom. And thank you very much. From the incredulity on your face, you see, how could that possibly be true? But it is true. And I just remember going into that classroom, and I had some desks and some chairs and a list of the children who were coming into my class, and nothing else. And that void between 9 o'clock on Monday morning to 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon was entirely mine to fill. And let me tell you, it was terrifying. But we did it. And we've moved from there, haven't we, to a situation where it is very difficult sometimes to find any chink in the curriculum as well. Very crowded curriculum, and I think overpopulated. And I think those sort of polarities are where we are, and I think we are actually at a very interesting time, because I think there is an important opportunity here for the profession, not just primary, but I think significantly primary is what we're doing. The other thing, Jim, I discovered about is we both have very unfortunate grandchildren, having us as their grandparents. And my eldest grandchild is called Millie. And I want to come back to this because I think one of the things that keeps Opening Minds and keeps minds open is humour. And I was just thinking of Millie staying at our house, and she was staying with the in-laws, her great-grandparents. And she was being potty trained, and wouldn't it be great if all children who started school were actually potty trained as well, or at least trained to do those sorts of things. Anyway, she decided she wanted to go to the loo, and she said, and her great-grandma said, well, she said, "Grandma, I want to go to the toilet." And so great-grandma said, "Okay." Said, "Well, do you sit on the loo?" She said, No, I've got a potty." And so great-grandma said, "Well, do you think Nana," that's my wife, "has got the potty?" And Millie looked at her for a bit and said, "Nah, she's too big." And that sort of literalness that you get, particularly from very young children, I know is what sustained me in my many years of working in schools. And I just think, and I will hark back to that because I think it's very important. It's only 2 weeks ago that I was in this room with Robin Alexander looking at the Cambridge Review. And I think we've got two immense pieces of work here. And it's not either or, it's actually a synthesis is what we should be looking at. And while we're looking at that synthesis, let's look at All Our Futures, fantastic piece of work produced a few years ago, which seems to have been completely ignored. But I'm just going to hearten you a bit. And this is what the Cambridge Review said about primary education. "What we must emphatically report is that primary schools appear to be under intense pressure, but in good heart. They are highly valued by children and parents, and in general are doing a good job. They do not neglect and have never neglected the 3 R's, and those at Westminster and in the media who regularly make this claim are either careless with facts or are knowingly fostering a calumny. And I think that's spot on. I have never, ever been to a primary schools where those basics are not important, but having those basics taught within a rich curriculum, I think, is where certainly what Open Minds is talking about, and certainly what was my experience over the years. So, and it goes on to say, and I think this is particularly true of those schools in areas where there are hard to teach children and hard to reach parents, and where the external community seems to have lost much of its morals and values, and indeed have taken on values that don't echo. That actually what it goes on to say is that for many, schools are at the centre when everything else falls apart. I think that's quite true. So I think this is a pivotal moment. What I want to do over the next 30 minutes is to look at the national framework, where you are in your schools and actually where you are personally, because if Opening Minds is going to take off in the primary sector, and indeed, you know, what I've seen and what I've read very much echoes, I think, very good primary practice. And I was really surprised in the 2008 review to read that it was mostly in place in Year 7 in secondary schools. So this is a real opportunity, isn't it, to make sure that those transfer arrangements between secondary and primary get to be very good. So let's just talk about the national framework and where we are. And this, let's get 2 or 3 things from Hargreaves and Fullan's book, What's Worth Fighting For in Education, which is a really, it's a thin read as well, a bit unlike the Cambridge Review, I've got to say, a thin read, and some very good nuggets in there. This is the first one. The insensitivities of many imposed reforms, the indignities inflicted by political and media criticism, and change efforts which turn over so rapidly they cannot be implemented properly are draining the energy of our teachers. I think, you know, that was written 12 years ago, and it is more true today, I think, than it was there. And you can absolutely, teachers are under the cosh to prove everything that they're doing, even more so head teachers who have been in some ways batting away some of the excesses in order to make sure that that classroom area is an area which is a place where good teaching and creativity can take place. And just to spin on that diagram, that certainly there are places where there has been security and certainty, and that can indeed lead to complacency. But we all need, do we not, a place of security and certainty. Maslow's hierarchy of needs tells us that. And it is, you know, we cannot spend all of our time out there being the adventurers. We need some place to come home to. I think that's true for children as well. And the security that you provide in your schools, I think, is something which is sometimes overlooked. The alternative to that is and I think does epitomize some of what I'm seeing across the country, is where there's insecurity and uncertainty. You're only as good as your last set of SAT results. You're only as good as the quality of the inspection team that comes in to see you. And that leads to frustration and anxiety and burnout and a feeling of, well, an increased sense of anxiety, which is partly why I think we have a real crisis in the primary sector of appointing head teachers. Fewer than 3 applicants per post is an extremely dangerous position to be in. And we've been taking this to the government for a number of years now. And it's actually the amount of bureaucracy and administration that's coming in, and this whole business of having to prove whatever you do. I was in a meeting at the DCSF the other day, and I was talking about this notion of 2 levels progress, which in my school was, for many of the children, was quite attainable. Not attainable for the high flyers who came into my junior school with a good level 3 and left with a level 5, because actually the way that's tracked doesn't amount to 2 years of 2 levels of progress. So there's a technical difficulty there, and that glass ceiling is one which perhaps needs to be removed. But it's also true for those children who come into the junior sector with a degree of learning difficulties, some 20% of all of those, the children who come in. And it's also true of them. And there are good reasons as to why those children haven't made good progress up to now, and this is not an excuse. And some of it could be about not good teaching, but mostly I think it's about the fact they do have learning difficulties. And I think one of the big things we have to do over the next few years is to focus on that group and make sure that they have the best possible outcomes. And this isn't about low expectations. And being in this group in the DCSF, they said, well, you've just got low aspirations, which I found a total insult, having spent all of my life being in school, as you have, in trying to raise standards of education and make children's lives bigger. And they said, well, we need some evidence of that. And I said, well, you've got the evidence. Well, where is it? I said, it's sitting here, in front of you. I am the evidence that this is the case. And I think there's got to be far more respect for your opinions and the profession if we're ever going to get out of this place. Good to hear read Gordon Brown in the TES, or some of it, in the TES last week, saying it is time to trust schools. I agree with you, Jim. It would be good to have that as a sterile debate, and it goes without saying. And more than 90% of the parents of your schools think you're doing a good job. So why is it then that less than 50% of the general public think you're doing a good job? And I think this is Baroness Perry's, who's a Conservative peer. She got this absolutely right. And she said it's like Gerald Ratner. And Gerald Ratner, who still sells, I believe, a jewellery, who had a glass of wine too many at a party one night and described, his words not mine, described his jewellery as crap. Which is, when he got up in the morning, he was quite surprised because he probably couldn't remember what he said, to find his share values had gone down. And what Baroness Perry says, that every time, we're going to get a lot of this, aren't we, between now and probably the 6th of May. What Baroness Perry says, every time some pundit stands up and slams into education, it lowers the share value of Education UK. And responsible politicians will have to stop doing that if they're ever going to get education in the place that they want it to be. Where we need to be, of course, is in a position where there is security, where people are convinced and secure in their teaching, in their skills, and in the construct of their school, and then you're in a place, are you not, to explore the boundaries of what you're doing in the way that Opening Minds suggests, in risk and innovation and creativity. We will never be in a risk-free society. But actually managing that risk is absolutely important. I think the risk averseness that we've got now is damaging education, particularly when it comes to outdoor education. And fewer people taking that up, despite learning outside the classroom. And actually, you know, whilst I agree absolutely with Jim that learning to learn is one of the great things, and seeing children being proud of what they're doing. We used to have a thing in Year 6 that said, look at me now. And we'd get their work out when they came in Year 3 and say, God, look how far you've come. And this is your individual learning journey. I don't care whether Freddie's doing better than you are. Look at what you've done. Look at me now. I think is a tremendous motivator for children. And I remember talking about language skills, taking some children on a journey in North Wales. We walked two-thirds of the way up Snowdon on one of those rare days in Wales where it was a beautiful blue sky. And we got about 65 children. And the deal was that the top 12 to 20 came with me up to the second lake. And so these 65 children went up to the first lake, and we took the 12 or 20 to the top lake. Quite a steep climb. It's up the back end of the Miners' Trail, if you know that. And we got up to this lake, and most of these children who came up with us were boys who were into football, fighting, and actually failure. But my goodness, you know, they were cracking good at, and they were our football team as well, and they were cracking good at that, and a few tomboys in there as well. And we're all getting up there and saying, "Oh, I was up first. No, I wasn't. I was up first." I said, "Just shush. Just shush for a minute and listen. Beautiful day, fantastic view. And these children stood and listened. This lake in front of them shimmering. And they heard for the first time in their lives the sound of silence. And Jason said, "Cool," he said, "Mr. Brookes, there's no words for this, are there?" Which was, that to me is deep learning. And Jason, I hope, will always remember that. Even though I thought, well, there are Jason, but you don't know them yet. And we come back to that. So look, I've always been inadequate. Inadequate? Keep that. I've always thought that it's much better to seek forgiveness than ask permission, and I've sort of run my life like that as well as being in school. So Hargreaves and Fullan also say this, which is why I think we're at a pivotal moment. If you're looking for hope for positive educational change, do not expect New Labour to provide it, or even if it's going to be New Conservative. If you're looking for hope, you must instead turn to yourselves. And I think that the profession has it within its grasp at the moment to take hold of the education agenda and say, look, we are pulling this back. And there has to be a balance. It's absolutely true that in the 70s there was a provider culture where inspectors were going to schools, and I remember the TGAT report, inspectors were going to schools, so well, you need to do more than just the 3 hours, you need to have a broad curriculum. Right, you are. Back on your heads. And nobody took any notice. And we've gone again to a situation now, and forgive this, but I only heard it the other day, and that's just so wonderful. I don't know if you've heard of it, which is seagull management. Seagulls come in, fly in, crap all over you, and then disappear again, which is very much what Ofsted feels like to some of us, I think, when you've had that unfortunate experience. But there are very good teams out there, and I've got to say that my experience has been good teams. And we've gained something out of this, but it is variable. So, where do we go in this national framework if we're going to do this? Well, I think there has to be some control on the interference of politics into education. I'm pleased Barry Shearman's here, because I think he's just the man to do this. So I think there should be, and this isn't NHT policy, Kathy, by the way. So I think there should be legislation that actually limits the power of the Secretary of State. There's been far too much fiddling around in the day-to-day management of our schools. We need to make sure that the inspection process is truly independent, and it is not a deficit model. That actually the inspectors come in looking at the value of your school rather than looking at its deficits. And they cannot do that on the back of a set of statistics being provided by somebody else. So they have to come into school, guess, with open minds. And the new framework was intended to be a framework where the teams worked with you. But what I'm getting right across the country is that actually in implementation, it isn't like that at all. Ensure that quangos are able to operate freely and without restraint. And the interference in QCA in 2008 with the debacle over the SATs and test results, I think is a really good example of that. And we've just seen in the newspaper this weekend the interference in the government scientific team who were ignored. And it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for us in schools if we only listen to our friends. Very dangerous government if the government is only going to listen to those people that are saying the things they want to hear. They have to listen to people like ATL, and good to have Nancy Ellis in the audience, and NAHT, who sometimes will tell them unpleasant truths. But we're not saying that from any union angle. Actually, we're saying it because we know it to be true. And actually what our unions are set up for is to improve the life chances of children in the end by improving the life chances and indeed the working conditions of those who work in schools. I think we need to refocus the role of local governance and accountability, and certainly in the primary sector. You know, you've got your SIP, you've got your school improvement person, you've got your governors, you've got your parents, you've got Ofsted, you've got everybody looking over your shoulder. Add to that all the people from the local authority looking at health and safety and health HR and all of those things, and you spend all your time trying to prove your existence rather than doing what you should be doing. And what I enjoyed doing is being head teacher. And being in there and influencing and working along with the excellent teams. And proportionate, and Jim, you touched on this, proportionate support and challenge. Just going through the sectors now, because we have a real issue with early years and early years funding, and I'm pleased to see that the NAHT has ended up on the front page of the Guardian for the right reasons today, because we have been pressing the government for many months now to look at their single funding stream for early years. Our expert research on this suggests that if this funding stream is allowed to go through as it is, then most of the jewel in the crown, early years provision in standalone nursery schools, will disappear. They will be closed. Nursery schools who, in Ofsted terms, actually 87% of them achieve outcomes which are good or better. And this is urgent, because once the funding mechanism is set in stone, and it's only this month, because local authorities will be doing that, then there is going to be devastation across the piece. I'm not exaggerating this. And with the stories we've got from as far afield as Hull, actually to Chelsea and Kensington and other places as well, where good early years provision is being halted. And I'm very pleased that Dawn Primarolo has taken that on board. We have to do something about that now in order to preserve that very best of foundation, because everything else stands upon it. And, primary and secondary and further education stands on that good start, and it's important that it's there. We need to, as well, further embed the early years foundation stage curriculum across all providers. But that's the curriculum, but we also need to look, and the word assessment comes in here right across the piece. And actually, Jim, I think it was wrong that you were prevented from looking at assessment in your review in the depth that you could have done that. And I think that in order to do that, we have to look at the way in which children are assessed. Assessing by 117 ticks in boxes, to me, is the wrong way of doing it. We need teachers involved on the floor with children, playing in the sandpit and modelling play, and modelling play as well, rather than with clipboards going around ticking off attainments. And this is the individual education plan for children with special needs who need those short steps put into place for all children, and it makes no logical sense whatsoever. I'll leave that bit out. Focus on structured play, and I think that's just so important, and a sort of assessment which is appropriate and proportionate. I think that the Cambridge review does have to be taken seriously, and there should be honest debate about that. And one of the things that we're particularly keen about is a review of the way in which children are assessed, not just in Key Stage 2. This is a much wider debate than that. And here's what they say about that. It is often claimed in defence of national tests that they raise standards. In fact, at best, the impact of national testing on standards is oblique. The prospect of testing, especially high-stakes testing, undertaken in the public arena, forces teachers, pupils, and parents to concentrate their attention on the areas of learning to be tested, too often to the exclusion of other activities of considerable educational importance. It is this intensity of focus and anxiety about the results and their consequences which make the initial difference to test scores, but essentially it is a halo effect. It doesn't last, for it is not testing that raises standards, but good teaching. And I think the culture which is inculcated by the current Key Stage 2 testing in testing in Key Stage 2 is the antithesis of what you're trying to aim for in opening minds. And so many colleagues have written in saying, we are fed up with having to rehearse these tests over and over again, which is why I make no apology whatsoever for the NAHT and the NUT getting together to say we want to put an end to this nonsense for once and for all. And we are making some progress with government. And make no doubt, we are in a process of change. The Key Stage 3 tests have gone. Why the same logic that applied to the Key Stage 3 test didn't apply to Key Stage 2, I think I will never know. And actually, science has gone as well, but I think I'm worried about science, because it's either all in or all out. So we are making progress on this, and if you're an NHT member, you will have your chance to have your say about whether you think reform needs to take place and whether, in fact, you're prepared to take or support action for that reform to take place as well. I absolutely agree in project-based learning, but with subject definition. And I think the best example of this is actually for children to make sure that they understand how a people's geography affects their history. And having a straitjacket, as Nick Gibb was saying, who's the Conservatives' shadow spokesperson for education, we want freedom for schools, but nevertheless you can do capes, bays and dates. It doesn't make any sense because that's what his mum taught when in the 1950s. So that doesn't make any sense. So we have actually to have freedom there. So for instance, if you're teaching in Bristol, surely you would look at the slave trade because that's where it all began. If you're teaching in Nottinghamshire, surely you would look at the development of the mines and the Industrial Revolution. So there has to be, I agree, a national prescription, if you like, but there has to be room for local application. I also think this is a time for primary voice, and I kind of agree with the idea of primary schools being the Cinderella service to something, and if that's true, how much more true of that is that of early years, and indeed special education. I do think that quite a lot of the indignities that we're suffering at the moment are a secondary-based view of what education should be like. They are different. They're quite right that they're different. And there should be a smooth flow through. There should be a synthesis through the primary curriculum and set up into the deepening education that children and depth of subject knowledge that children will need in secondary education. So I think we should change the name of special education and make it specialist education, because there are people in special schools throughout the country who have immense expertise in, for instance, conditions such as autism, and so do you in your schools as well. And getting the appropriate setting for children is right. We must not sacrifice children's progress on the altar of inclusivity where that is totally... where that actually leads to outcomes for children which actually they're not in the best setting. I went to a fabulous special school down on the south coast in Eastbourne, and there were 26, it was all boys, 26 boys in this school, all of whom had got severe behaviour difficulties. And you're all experienced. You can go into any classroom, within 5 seconds you've spotted them, haven't you? And think, right, watch that one. There's 26 of them there, but they had an 87% inclusion back into the school rate. So outreach, inreach, and making sure that children have re-entry, I think, is the right place to go with that. And a learner-focused curriculum, but a serious debate about how we manage disruptive behaviour, because I don't think we've got this right. And we've gone from a culture where you just simply pass them on to the next school, into another culture now where it's extremely difficult to manage. So I think, as well, opening minds helps this. And I know my own school, tackling bullying in the playground, because the greatest resource you have in your school are the children in it. And tackling bullying in the playground by putting the children in charge. They know who the bullies are. They know where bullying takes place. Far more than one midday meal supervisor standing in the middle of the playground, or even two who are spending there all the time talking to each other rather than supervising the children. And in secondary, there has to be a respect of our different phases and different places. I never forget being in the snooker club where I used to play in Lincolnshire. And I'd been head of a small school in Lincolnshire for a while. They said, "Oh," he said, "you've been at that school 5 years now. You must be nearly ready to go on to secondary." So after I'd hit him with my snooker cue, Deepening specialism, again, assessment reform. I think we've got a curriculum which is almost totally dominated by assessment. A properly differentiated curriculum. What is there for those 8% of young people who leave after 11 years with virtually nothing to show for their time in the education system? What an indictment that is. So there has to be some freeing up and opening minds about how we actually cater for those young people. And in your school as well, you are the gatekeepers and gate openers of your schools. And you have those opportunities for children to go on. And don't forget those unexpected gifts that you get back. Because I know, some parents are very quick to chide and very slow to bless, aren't they? And so it's great when you meet one, as I did outside Curry's the other day, and his son was Gary. And he said, Mr. Brookes, I'd just like to thank you, because Gary has gone to university. He's the first one ever in our family to go to university. It was after the cracking good start you gave him in your school. I thought, wow, that was an unbidden gift. I mean, most of the unbidden gifts, you get a bottle of Lambrusco or something like that. But when you get that genuine praise, it's really worth hanging on to. And it does make a huge difference. And the school in the community, I think, is absolutely right. But what we should have been given are the headlines. Please involve your school in the community in the way that's best for your children in your school. There should be no prescription whatsoever as to what that looks like, except that you are to be held to account, of course, for how that is. And in some schools, the all singing, all dancing, extended day and joined-up services is absolute sense. Sometimes it makes sense for schools to cluster together to have that sort of community together. And I mean, I just remember the fight I had to get the speech therapist to come into school rather than the 7 children in my school who needed speech therapy would go to Mansfield. Only one of them got it, because the other 6 parents either couldn't or wouldn't take their children there. And after 6 months persuading the speech therapist to come in, they got their entitlement. I think it's an entitlement. And there's a no-brainer there. Early intervention. Most families are not like the family of Baby P. Most families are in difficulty with their children, lost control of them by the time they were 2, and actually they're screaming out for help. We can't give it, always, and certainly if you phone up social services, they can't give it either, and I'm not blaming social services because they're busy firefighting, and they can't attend to some of the problems we identify. But when little Catherine comes into school, has been as bright as a button, and comes into school reclusive and sad, then it's very important that there's some way of intervening. And surely it's not beyond the wit of us to say there needs to be a person working in schools, a schools-based, not person from social services, because once you have that label on it, the shutters come down. But a schools-based family worker, actually such as we had in Morsop in the 1980s before funding got chopped, who can go into those families and actually spend 2 hours with a family and 10 minutes writing it up, not the other way around, which tends to be what happens at the moment. So that journey is local definition according to need, from dependence on local authority services, which sadly are in decline. Taking the E out of the LEA, I think, was one of the bad things that's happened over the past 12 years, but actually towards a culture of interdependence is very important. And that appropriate balance, I think taking the E out of the DFES as well was also wrong. The appropriate balance between, and remember that schools are still places of learning. Very quickly, what curriculum in school? And, whilst we've got a given curriculum, what about some of these things? Jonathan Porritt says that in terms of global warming, any vestige of business as usual in our schools will see us fall into the abyss. Children in primary schools now will be in their 40s when the oil runs out. So what do we do? How do we prepare them for that future? Well, I think the best way of saving the world is for our children in our primary schools to save it. Really proud of the fact that primary schools were described as being hotbeds of environmental radicalism. Matthew's in place, it's time to stop. So I will just finish these off. But again, what are the jobs? If the jobs that are the most popular jobs in 2010 weren't invented, at the beginning of this decade, then what are we doing for children's views of themselves? And taking control, finally, I think, making sure that you're in the best place to lead your schools in that creative, dynamic way which is described by Opening Minds. I think these things are important. First of all change begins with you. Let's go back to Hargreaves and Fulham. Don't wait for anybody else to do it. It's not going to happen. So all change starts with you, and I think all change starts with us. And I think this really is a moment for the primary community to stand up and be counted and tell the government, whatever government it is, what needs to happen next. You must make time for yourself and for your friends and your family. They're the ones that get neglected in your highly pressurized job, and they're totally important. Visit your wellsprings. Make sure you go to those places that renew you, whether that be music or walking or sport or art or whatever it is. Take time for it, because we spend all of our time looking after other people and not nearly enough time looking after ourselves. It's a bit like when you get on EasyJet and they say, before fitting the oxygen mask to others, make sure you've got your own fitted. I think that's a vital message, and not just for EasyJet. And laugh and know when it's time to go, and I see from the clock that it is. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today.